The spheres of influence. What triggers a hoover by a narcissist? Hoovering is something that is of considerable concern to victims of narcissists. Whether you'll be hoovered depends upon whether the first is a hoover trigger, and if there is, whether the hoover execution criteria has been met. And you can understand more about this process in the video, Will I Be Hoovered? This video explains to you what the spheres of influence are that can result in there being a hoover trigger. There are numerous factors which govern whether we will attempt to hoover you post-escape or post-discard. And some of those factors determine the style of the hoover, whether it be malign or benign, and how often those attempts will be made. There are several considerations which have a material impact on whether a hoover will occur, and the starting point is the sphere of influence and your relationship to it. There are 6 spheres of influence. Imagine, if you will, me. Now, I know you often do this, as I'm your guilty little secret, aren't I? But we haven't got time for that at the moment. So envisage me sat at home at Tudor Towers, or in one of the offices that I might frequent, or that I'm walking between bars. Let's take an instance of me being in a bar. What is my sphere of influence? Well, to be accurate, there are actually several, and they vary in applicability and range. The first is the physically proximate sphere, namely those who are within earshot of me. This is the closest sphere of influence, and unsurprisingly, the most dangerous for you. It is within this sphere of influence when the full range of charismatic and magnetic charms can be deployed in order to pull you back under my influence. Anybody who I can speak to or listen to, be sat with or dine with, stand next to or be near, is in this sphere of influence, and if they are, they have just caused a hoover trigger, meaning that my narcissism, alongside my awareness, determines, is it appropriate now to hoover this individual? And in so doing, assert control over them directly and draw fuel from them. So the first sphere of influence is the physically proximate sphere. The second sphere is the eye-line sphere. This is the sphere where I can see you or you can see me. We may be across the street or on the other side of a field, up in an office, walking across a plaza, across from you on the piste. If we can see you or you can see us, then you are in this sphere. I might not be able to communicate with you other than to shout or wave, but it remains a sphere of influence. Accordingly, this is when we seek to hoover somebody. We might not be able to speak directly with them, but we can position ourselves stood across from your house on the other side of the street, or waiting across the square from where you leave work. And if we are positioned in such an instance and we see you, you enter that second sphere. That's a hoover trigger, and then the hoover execution criteria are applied to ascertain whether we will then hoover you in some form thereafter. The third sphere of influence is our reach through our coterie and our lieutenants. Whether these people are our friends, inner or outer circle, colleagues, minions or family, if they operate as our lieutenants or are members of our coterie, they form part of a sphere of influence. If you speak to these people, therefore, operate in their first sphere, and some of them actually may be narcissists, or they see you or you see them, therefore you enter into their second sphere, you then become caught within my third sphere of influence. When you enter the first or second sphere of a member of the coterie or the lieutenant, you can rest assured that news of your appearance there will be relayed to me. This might be relayed to me in person, by telephone, text or email message, but the news will reach me. This also then allows me to send information to you by proxy, as my coterie and lieutenants tell you about what I'm doing, and that's a hoover by proxy. So therefore, if you are talking to or are seen by members of our coterie or lieutenants, you've entered the third sphere of influence. That causes a hoover trigger, which can then lead to you being hoovered. The fourth sphere of influence is our reach through the telephone. I don't mean by text messages or messenger on social media, but actually speaking on the telephone. Whilst we may be thousands of miles from you, unseen and not physically proximate at all, The fact that you are speaking to us allows us to extend our reach in an effective way through the use of the telephone. FaceTime and Skype and similar applications fall within this sphere as well. And therefore, if you telephone us, you then enter the fifth sphere of influence, meaning you've caused a Hoover trigger, and therefore, if the Hoover execution criteria are met thereafter, we will assert control over you directly by hoovering you. Next, there is the fifth sphere of influence, which manifests through the sending of text messages, emails, letters, notes wrapped around bricks thrown through the window, smoke signals, etc. There isn't any actual speaking to one another, there's no third party involved, there's no physical proximity. So if you send the narcissist a text message, you've entered the narcissist's fifth sphere of influence, you've caused a Hoover trigger, and therefore presents a risk, if the Hoover execution criteria are met, that you will then be hoovered. Accordingly, the first 5 spheres are influenced by you actually doing something, coming to talk to us or being sat with us, being seen by us, being seen by members of our coterie or our lieutenants, ringing us up or texting us, emailing us, social media messaging us. Therefore, if you impose a total no-contact regime to stay away from those various spheres, you will reduce the risk of Hoover triggers considerably. We then come to the 6th sphere of influence, which is in effect the mind of the narcissist. You may pop up in the mind of the narcissist for no reason whatsoever, a random thought. Or we are reminded of you by something, for instance, a song or a fragrance, or we see a car that reminds us of you. Or somebody happens to mention you. For instance, they might ask, how are you getting on with Rebecca these days? And therefore, they may not be aware that you've been disengaged from some months ago, and their mention of you causes you to enter the 6th sphere. You have no control over this 6th sphere. There's nothing you can do about it. You could just pop into our heads, or we are reminded of you by something or someone. That causes a Hoover trigger, and if the Hoover execution criteria are met, then you will be hoovered. And so the existence of the 6th sphere of influence means that there is always a risk for you of you being hoovered, because there's always a risk that a Hoover trigger will be caused by your entry into the 6th sphere of influence. Following your escape or your disengagement, if you enter into any of these spheres, then you cause a Hoover trigger, and if the Hoover execution criteria are met, then this means that you will be hoovered. Accordingly, if you've been effecting a no-contact regime and then I see you on a bus travelling on the high street, you've entered my 2nd sphere of influence, there is a Hoover trigger. You've come to my attention, you're on my radar. If the Hoover execution criteria determines that I should assert control over you directly and therefore hoover you, I may well wave at you to get your attention, or run along the road to catch up with the bus and board it, so I can bring you into my 1st sphere. I may be minded then to make efforts to contact you in some other fashion. But the fact that you have sailed close to me, appeared in my sphere, does 2 things. First of all, it alerts you to me, it brings you on the radar, and therefore creates the risk of a Hoover. And also there is a risk for you, because your emotional thinking will increase, because you've seen us, because it's an interaction, albeit a brief one. And therefore your emotional thinking wakes up by increasing, and might cause you to then contact us. Accordingly, when you enter a sphere of influence, there is a risk that we will hoover you, and you're at a heightened risk of the hoover then succeeding because of your emotional thinking awakening, so that you are, if you like, tenderized, more vulnerable, so that if the hoover does occur, you're more likely to respond to it positively. By way of example, sometimes we seek to draw you into our sphere of influence, and we wait around outside where we know you work, and we're, in essence, trying to draw you into our sphere of influence in the expectation of seeing you, and then that's a Hoover trigger. So you have probably entered the 6th sphere, causing us to then implement a passive Hoover by waiting around outside, governed by our narcissism, so that you then enter the 2nd sphere, which causes us then to enact a more proximate Hoover, the slice, slice, slice approach. You might decide that you need to return some property of ours and you call around at our house to drop it off. This is a breach of no contact, because by coming to see us, you've entered our first sphere of influence through this act, and therefore you've caused a Hoover trigger, and therefore increased the risk of being hoovered. Or it's late at night and your emotional thinking is high, and therefore we are on your mind. But you are not on ours, and you can't help but send us a text asking us how we are. This then causes you to enter the fifth sphere of influence, and therefore is a Hoover trigger, meaning that there is a risk of you then being hoovered. And of course, in such circumstances, there is an increased risk of being hoovered when there is an electronic means of doing so. Doesn't mean that it's guaranteed. There might be some factors that militate against hoovering you, but often, if the electronic route is available, you're more than likely to be hoovered. You can, of course, influence how many of these spheres of influence operate with regard to you. Stay out of our way, impose a total no-contact regime, ensure that we don't know where to find you, and you'll prevent spheres 1 and 2 from working. Ensure that you're never mentioned to our friends, and that you avoid contact with those people who are in our coterie or our lieutenants. Then you destroy the third sphere and stay out of it. Avoid the temptation to ring us, avoid the temptation to text us, and you stay out of the fourth and fifth. Ensure you don't message us, don't send emails, or even application request, and you'll counter the fifth sphere. The only one that you have no influence over is the sixth sphere. Remember, you may just pop into our minds from time to time, and there's nothing you can do about it. Or we might be reminded of you by something or someone, and again, there is nothing that you can do about it. There remains a risk, because of the six spheres, there is nothing that you can do in terms of staying out of the sixth sphere, but there is much you can do through the influence of your no-contact regime by staying out of the first 5 spheres of influence. And it's important for you to recognize what these 6 spheres are. Entry into any of them causes a Hoover trigger and raises the prospect, but not the guarantee, that you will be hoovered. That falls to whether the Hoover execution criteria have been met. I'm HG Tudor. Thank you for listening.